There was a place that once hosted millions of birthday parties every year across America. More than any family restaurant chain you can think of. More than what you even remember. And then somehow it slipped out of your life without making a sound loud enough for you to notice. If you were a kid in this country from 1998 to 2005, there was always a place at the end of the hallway in every suburban mall, a place you heard before you saw it. That sound was unlike anything else. Electronic music blasting from dozens of small speakers, the sound of metal coins dropping into machines, the constant pulling of paper tickets, the sound of kids laughing, screaming, arguing. All of it layered into a thick, chaotic, but familiar wall of sound that you could recognize from 2 stores away. And then you saw the door. The bright sign. Red, yellow, purple. You pushed the door open and the outside world stopped. The smell of hot pizza hit you first. Melting cheese, tomato sauce, flour, and that very specific smell of old carpet that had soaked up thousands of little shoes every day. The air inside was warmer, heavier, and louder. Flashing lights came from every direction. Red, blue, yellow, reflecting off plastic and metal surfaces. Arcade machines lined up in rows, stretching toward the back as if there was no end. The front was okay. The pizza counter where adults stood in line, the menu board hanging high, unlimited soda refills, a few plastic tables and chairs where parents sat checking their watches. But the front was not why you came. The front was for the adults. The back was what you remembered, and before you could run back there, you stopped. You looked at your parents' hands. You waited, and then they gave you a handful of tokens, maybe 15, maybe 30 if it was your birthday. Those round metal coins with the faded logo, cold in the palm of your hand. They clinked against each other, making a very specific sound. You clenched your fist, and in that moment you understood something no one needed to explain. This was how you controlled this place. You did not walk. You ran. You charged into the arcade as if slowing down meant someone would take everything worth having. Inside, the flashing lights were faster. Every machine was an invitation. Every machine was a chance. Skee ball on the left, you held the ball, threw it up the ramp, trying to get it into the 100-point ring. The shooting game up front, you squeezed the trigger, the screen shook, targets moved faster than you thought. The racing game in the corner, the steering wheel vibrated under your hands, simulated engine sounds filled your ears. And then there were the ticket machines. That was what you really wanted. You dropped the token in. The clink sounded. You played. You won. And the machine started ringing. A high, continuous sound. And then the tickets poured out. Not one sheet. A long strip. 10 tickets. Poured out. Not one sheet. A long strip. 10 tickets. 20 tickets. Maybe 100 if you were lucky. You pulled them out. Felt them in your hands. And you wanted more. "Mom, can I have more tokens?" you said, without taking your eyes off the machine. You did not think about money. You did not think about time. You only thought about the next turn. Play, win, get tickets, repeat. In the back there was a long table. Your friends were sitting there. Kids from class, from the neighborhood. Paper cone hats. Plastic-lidded cups of soda. Pizza brought out on trays, each tray cut into 8 even slices. "Come blow out the candles," someone called you. You turned around, a little reluctantly. You sat down. You picked up a slice of pizza. You took a bite. It was hot, cheesy, but you were not really paying attention because you could still hear the sounds from the arcade in the back. It never stopped. It was always there. And then the lights changed. A few lights went off. The music switched. A familiar tune played. Staff appeared with the cake. Candles were lit, and everyone started singing. You stood there or sat there, you were not sure. You just knew all eyes were on you. This was your moment, and then Chuck E. Cheese appeared. The gray mouse costume, purple shirt, fixed smile. It stepped out from the back, waving, dancing to the music. Maybe you found it a little weird. Maybe you thought it was awesome. But at that moment it did not matter. What mattered was that it was there. On your day. Happy birthday. Everyone sang louder. You blew out the candles. Everyone clapped. And then everything went back to normal. The lights came back on. The sounds returned, but something had happened, and you knew it. You went back to the arcade, because you still had tokens. And when the last tokens disappeared, you carried a long stack of tickets to the prize counter. Behind the glass were dozens of items. Stuffed animals, candy, plastic toys. Some things cost 20 tickets, some cost 200. You counted the tickets. The staff counted them again. "You have enough for this one," they said, pointing to an item you had been eyeing earlier. You chose. You held it in your hands. It was small. But it was not small. It was the prize. It was the proof. It was the result of everything you had just done. You did not come here for the pizza. You did not come here for the tables and chairs. You came here for that feeling, the feeling of winning, the feeling of being celebrated, the feeling that for a few hours everything was designed for you. And when you left, when the door closed behind you, the sounds faded. The flashing lights disappeared. You carried something you could not hold in your hands. A memory. A day. A feeling. That was Chuck E. Cheese, not a restaurant, but a place where millions of kids felt like their birthday really mattered. Now here is how it all began, and how one man from the gaming industry turned a simple idea into the biggest birthday empire in America. There was a place that once hosted millions of birthday parties every year across America. Everything did not begin with birthday cake or paper tickets or a child standing at the prize counter trying to decide between a stuffed animal and a bigger than usual candy. It began with one person, Nolan Bushnell, born in 1943 in Utah, an engineer, an entrepreneur, and the founder of Atari in 1972. The company that brought games like Pong to the world and accidentally created an entire new industry. In the mid-1970s, arcade games began to explode across America. Standalone machines appeared in bars, convenience stores, and shopping malls. Children and teenagers were drawn to their lights and sounds, willing to stand for hours just to play one more round. But Bushnell saw a problem that others overlooked. The kids stayed. The parents did not. They stood in the back, waiting, bored, and eventually pulled their children out of there, and when they left, the revenue left with them. His insight was not complicated. If you gave parents a reason to stay, the kids would play longer, and if the kids played longer, they would spend more money. In 1977, in San Jose, California, he turned that idea into reality with the first store named Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. A long, hard-to-remember name, but the model inside was unlike anything that had existed before. Pizza was served in the front, Atari game machines lined up in the back, and on stage were animatronic characters, singing and moving robots that created an experience a child at that time could hardly find anywhere else. At the center of it all was Chuck E. Cheese, a mouse in a gray suit with a fixed smile, becoming the face of the entire brand. This model did not just sell pizza or games, it sold time, it sold experience. And most importantly, it kept the whole family there longer than any arcade before it. In the early years, the model grew quickly. Too quickly. By the early 1980s, the company had expanded to dozens of locations across America. But that speed came with costs, and the costs came with risks. In 1983, a competitor appeared, Showbiz Pizza Place, backed by creative engineering and featuring the Rock-afire Explosion animatronic band, which many considered more impressive. The competition was direct, same model, same customers, same core experience. And while Chuck E. Cheese expanded quickly, Showbiz expanded more carefully. By 1984, Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with tens of millions of dollars in debt. On paper, the story was almost over, but Showbiz did not miss the opportunity. They bought the assets, merged the two companies, and decided to keep the name Chuck E. Cheese, a decision that sounded small but shaped the entire future of the brand. After the merger, the company was restructured under the name Showbiz Pizza Time Inc. and began standardizing the model. By the late 1980s, they gradually phased out the Showbiz brand and converted the entire system to Chuck E. Cheese. This was when the formula was truly perfected. Pizza, arcade, birthdays. Free elements no longer separate but tightly bound together into an efficient money-making system. Kids came to play, parents paid for the birthday party, and every party became a returning customer in the future. By the early 1990s, the company operated hundreds of locations across the United States, with hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Birthday packages were standardized, with fixed prices including pizza, tokens, and the mascot performance. A child who had a birthday there at age 8 was very likely to return at age 9, and so were their friends. It was not just business, it was a cultural loop. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Chuck E. Cheese had become the default choice for children's birthdays in America. Millions of parties every year, millions of cakes, billions of tokens used. You could move from California to Texas, from New York to Florida, and the experience was almost identical. Same lights, same sounds, same feeling. But like many other stories, the very things that made it successful also began to change. In the late 1990s, home console games like Sony's PlayStation and later Microsoft's Xbox began to develop rapidly. Kids no longer needed to go to the arcade for the best gaming experience. They could have it right in the living room. Animatronics, once a technological highlight in 1977, began to look outdated in the early 2000s. The slow-moving, repetitive robots no longer impressed a generation accustomed to 3D graphics and online games. The company began cutting costs. Some locations scaled back the stage. Some removed parts of the experience. Not immediately, but little by little, what made this place special began to disappear. And the most notable thing was that while all of this was happening, most customers did not notice right away. They still came. They still had birthday parties. But the feeling had changed. It was no longer as strong as before. No longer as new as before, and that was how big things began to weaken, not with one big collapse, but with hundreds of small changes that no one really noticed until it was too late. And then it worked. Not only worked, but expanded at a speed few could have predicted at the time. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, after restructuring under the name Showbiz Pizza Time Inc. in 1984 and then changing its name to CEC Entertainment Inc. in 1998, Chuck E. Cheese began opening hundreds of locations across the United States, from California to Texas, from Illinois to Florida, slipping into almost every suburb that had a shopping mall large enough to hold it. By the early 1990s, the system had more than 300 locations, and by the end of that decade, the number exceeded 450 stores nationwide. But what made its strength was not just the number of stores. It was the system inside. A system so simple that almost anyone could understand it, but sophisticated enough to keep customers there longer than they intended. Everything started with tokens. You did not pay directly for the games. You exchanged money for tokens. Those small metal coins became a separate currency inside the space. You no longer thought about dollars. You thought about how many tokens you had left in your hand. A basic package might be 10 tokens for a few dollars, or 40 tokens for a birthday party. Each game cost 1 or 2 tokens. And every time you dropped a token into the machine, you were not just paying. You were activating an experience. That changed the way you spent money. You did not see yourself spending. You saw yourself playing. And when the tokens ran out, you did not stop. You went back to the counter. You bought more. It was a closed economy. But tokens were only the first step. The thing that really kept you there was the prize tickets. Every game was not just win or lose. It was a chance to earn tickets. And tickets had no real value outside that space, but inside, they were everything. You played, you won, and the machine started printing tickets. A long strip of paper, maybe 5 tickets, 10 tickets, or if you were lucky, 50 tickets. Skee-ball machines or jackpot games could even give you hundreds of tickets in one rare play. You held them, you accumulated them, you compared them with your friends, and you kept playing because the next turn might bring more. That was the loop the company understood very well from early on. Playing was not the final goal. The reward was what made you come back. And once you had tickets, you did not want to stop until you had enough to redeem something bigger. Meanwhile, in the back, another system was working in parallel. Birthday parties, standardized, packaged, and sold as a complete product. Parents did not need to think much. They paid a fixed price. In the 1990s, a standard birthday package could range from $100 to $200 depending on the number of kids and the tokens included. And in return, they got everything. The party table, pizza, drinks, tokens for each child, the birthday cake brought out on time, and the mascot appearance at the exact right moment. It was not a spontaneous party. It was a process. A system that could be repeated thousands of times each week nationwide with almost no variation. That created steady, repeatable, predictable revenue. And when a child had a good birthday experience, there was a high chance they would want to return the next year, and so would their friends. That was how the system fed itself. But there was another element that made this place different from any other restaurant: animatronics. Robot bands performing on stage, characters like Chuck E. Cheese, Helen Henny, Jasper T., Jowls, Mr. Munch, all programmed to sing, move, and perform to music. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, this was not common. This was not something you saw everywhere. This was entertainment technology. A simpler version of what you might see in a theme park, but placed right in a local shopping mall. The shows were scheduled, usually every hour or every 30 minutes, and kids would gather in front of the stage to watch. For a child, it was not just a performance. It was part of the birthday, part of the memory. And when you combined all these elements together, you had something very rare. A complete experience. A place where you could eat, play, and celebrate in the same space. It was not Disneyland, but it did not need to be Disneyland. It was a miniature amusement park, cheaper, closer, and more accessible, and that mattered more than anything else, because it was not a special trip once a year. It was a place you could return to many times, and each time the experience was almost the same. That created a very special kind of memory, a repeating memory. By the mid-1990s, Chuck E. Cheese was not just a business, it was part of American culture. Millions of birthday parties were held each year across the system, with an estimated more than 40 million customers visiting annually by the end of that decade. Millions of kids blew out candles under the same kind of lights, heard the same song, played the same kind of games. You could move from one state to another, but the experience barely changed. And that was exactly its power. It became the default choice. When a child asked, "Where do I want to have my birthday?" the answer often required no thought. It was already there. The change did not come on one specific day. There was no single moment when everything stopped and someone said, "From today it will no longer be the same." It began slowly, very slowly. In the late 1990s, around 1998, Sony released the PlayStation in America and quickly sold millions of units, bringing 3D gaming experiences into family living rooms. 2 years later, in 2001, Microsoft launched the Xbox, a more powerful, faster system designed to compete directly with everything the arcade once represented. And that was the first time this happened on a large scale. Before, if you wanted the best gaming experience, you had to go out. You had to go to the arcade. But now, you could have it at home. No tokens needed. No waiting for your turn. No leaving the living room. And that changed everything, but not immediately. At first, Chuck E. Cheese still operated. Kids still came. Birthdays were still held. But there was a small difference. The machines in the arcade were no longer the newest thing. They were no longer something you could not get anywhere else. And when the technological advantage disappeared, the rest of the experience had to carry the full weight. Meanwhile, animatronics, once a technological highlight in 1977, began to look different. Not because they changed, but because the world around them had changed faster. The slow-moving, repetitive robots singing pre-programmed songs began to look outdated to a generation growing up with 3D graphics, the internet, and later online games. By the early 2000s, many kids no longer gathered in front of the stage like before. They turned away and went straight to the arcade, and then gradually, they did not even do that anymore. The company began to notice this, but their response was not strong innovation. It was cost-cutting. Operating costs for a Chuck E. Cheese store were not small. Game machines needed maintenance. Animatronics needed repairs. Large spaces needed staff, and when revenue began to stall, the fastest way to protect profits was to reduce costs. Some locations began scaling back the stage. Some reduced the number of animatronic characters. Some simply turned them off for most of the day. No one announced it. There were no signs. But if you returned after a few years, you would notice something was no longer there. The space also changed. Stores opened in the late 1990s and early 2000s began to look different from the earlier ones. Less color, less detail, cleaner perhaps, more modern perhaps, but also less special, less of a feeling that you were stepping into a place completely different from the outside world. Instead, it began to feel like a family restaurant with a few extra game machines in the back. And when that happened, a question began to emerge, even if no one said it out loud. If this is just a restaurant with games, why not go somewhere else that is better? Meanwhile, the outside world did not stand still. The 2000s saw the explosion of the internet, online games, and forms of home entertainment that did not require leaving your seat. By 2005, Nintendo launched the Wii, a family-oriented system that brought collective gaming experiences right into the living room. What Chuck E. Cheese once did in its space could now happen at home. No driving needed, no booking a party, no spending hundreds of dollars for an afternoon. At the same time, competitors in the family entertainment sector also began to appear and grow. Places like Dave & Buster's, which started in 1982 but exploded in the 2000s, offered more modern arcade experiences aimed at teenagers and adults. Entertainment areas in shopping malls also began to diversify, from modern movie theaters to bowling alleys, trampoline parks, and later VR centers. Chuck E. Cheese was no longer the only choice, and more importantly, it was no longer the best choice. But none of this happened all at once. There was no single year when revenue suddenly dropped 50%. There was no single day when customers stopped coming completely. Instead, it was a series of small changes. Slightly fewer customers on weekends. Slightly fewer birthday parties each month. Slightly fewer kids gathering in front of the stage each year. Changes so small that if you were a customer, you might not notice, and if you were the company, you might not react fast enough. By the mid-2000s, Chuck E. Cheese still existed, still open, still had birthdays, but it was no longer at its peak. It was no longer the place every kid thought of first by default. And that was how big things began to change. Not with one collapse, but with hundreds of small things, each not big enough to cause panic, but enough to accumulate over time. And then at some point, it no longer felt like what you remembered. But no one really stopped to point out exactly when that happened. There was no final birthday party where someone stood up and said, "This is the last time it felt special." Instead, the experience began to become familiar in a different way. Not the warm kind of familiar, but the boring kind of familiar. The walls looked the same. The tables looked the same. The game machines, even though they still flashed and made sounds, were no longer new, no longer different from what you could find elsewhere. Chuck E. Cheese began to become a replaceable place. And when a place can be replaced, it is no longer a destination. It is just an option. Kids no longer said, "I want to have my birthday there," with the same certainty as before. They had other choices. Trampoline parks, IMAX movie theaters, bowling alleys, even hosting at home with a console and a few friends. Parents too, they were no longer limited to one single model. They could choose cleaner, newer, or simply more convenient experiences. And when you had more choices, you began to compare. And when you began to compare, Chuck E. Cheese no longer topped the list like before. By the late 2010s, the parent company CEC Entertainment still operated more than 600 locations worldwide, with about 500 locations in the United States. But that number hid another reality. Revenue was no longer growing as before. Customer numbers gradually declined, and the experience inside continued to be simplified to save costs. Some locations completely removed animatronics. Some replaced them with digital screens. Some scaled back the space. These changes might have made business sense, but each change took away a piece of what once made this place different. And then 2020 happened. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the United States. States began closing restaurants, entertainment centers, and anywhere that could gather large groups of people. Chuck E. Cheese, a model that completely depended on kids gathering in enclosed spaces, had almost no way to operate. Revenue nearly disappeared in just a few weeks. And on June 24, 2020, CEC Entertainment officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. This was not the first time the company faced a crisis, but this time was different. This time, the problem was not just financial, it was the model. When stores closed nationwide, hundreds of locations temporarily stopped operating, and many of them never reopened. The company was forced to restructure debt, close underperforming locations, and find a way to survive in a world where large in-person birthday parties were no longer a given. By 2021, after emerging from bankruptcy, Chuck E. Cheese began testing new models, delivering pizza, selling through virtual brands like Pasquale's Pizza and Wings on food delivery apps, updating store spaces, removing nearly all animatronics and replacing them with screens and interactive dance floors. These changes helped the company survive. But surviving was not the same as before, because in the process, something important had happened. They did not just lose customers, they lost the reason customers once came. Before, you came because there was nowhere else like it. Now, you could find parts of that experience in many other places, often better, newer, or more convenient. And when you were no longer the only choice, you had to compete. But Chuck E. Cheese had never been built to compete like a regular restaurant or a modern entertainment center. It had been built to be one of a kind, something irreplaceable. And today, it is still there, not completely gone. Not like many other names that only exist in memory. As of 2025, Chuck E. Cheese, under the parent company CEC Entertainment, still operates more than 460 locations in the United States and dozens of international locations. You can still drive to a shopping mall, see the familiar logo, and step inside. But if you do that, you will realize almost immediately that it no longer feels like before. The animatronic stages that were once the center of everything, the robot bands that once performed every hour, have almost completely disappeared after the 2.0 remodel program implemented since 2017. In their place are digital screens, interactive dance floors, more modern, cleaner, faster LED lighting. The space has been redesigned, neater, more efficient, but also less distinctive. Less of a feeling that you are stepping into a different world. Kids still come, they still play games, but most of the experience is no longer very different from what they can find at home or at any other entertainment center. And there are adults who step inside, not to play, not to have a birthday party, but just to look around a bit, to see what is left, to look for something familiar in a space that has changed. And sometimes they find it, a small corner, a sound, a fleeting feeling, but never quite the same as before, because the brand is still there, the name is still there. But the version that existed in the 1990s and early 2000s is no longer there. And if you once had a birthday there, once held those metal tokens in your hand, once stood in front of the stage and listened to the robots sing, you will remember, not every detail, but enough to know that it used to be different. And somewhere in your memory, there is still a birthday party, a day, a moment that proves that place once existed. If you want to hear more stories like this, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next stories.